So welcome. My name is Professor Heather McLeod-Kilmurray, and I'm the co-director of the Center for Environmental Law and Global Sustainability here at the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa, with my co-director, Professor Thomas Burelli. And we're very pleased to launch this year's speaker series with our very own Professor Lynda Collins and her fantastic new book, The Ecological Constitution. So Professor Collins is an expert in a wide variety of fields of environmental law, including toxic torts, among many others. But recently, her research has focused on ecological constitutionalism. And it's a fascinating new book that I encourage you all to read. It's a joy to read, and it's very illuminating. And you may note that David Boyd, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, after he read the book, said, "This engaging and insightful book offers a blueprint for rewriting the ground rules of civilization." So that's high praise indeed. And I think Professor Collins might mention some of David Boyd's more recent victories during her talk today. So thank you very much for being here, Professor Collins. I will just note for everyone attending that we are recording this. Feel free to put any questions in the chat, and I will direct them to Professor Collins. But of course, once she's finished her talk, you're welcome to ask her your questions as well over Zoom.
All right, thank you very much, Professor McLeod-Kilmurray. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. Among the many blessings of my career has been the absolute privilege of belonging to U of O's Center for Environmental Law and Global Sustainability. It's really an incredible community of scholars, including colleagues and students and friends. It's really been a home for me, and I know many others at the faculty. So I'm very happy to have the chance to present in the Environmental Law Speaker Series. I am coming to you today from Ottawa, from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. And I honor and pay my respects to the Algonquin people, past, present, and future, as guardians and stewards of this territory from time immemorial. And today, what I want to talk about is the optimistic potential of constitutions in our journey towards ecological sustainability. So I think we're all aware that the context of this conversation and any conversation about environmental law involves kind of an ongoing global ecological crisis. So we're all aware that we're facing big challenges. And it's not going to be my task today to summarize or emphasize those challenges, because I think certainly everybody on this call is well aware of the job before us. What I'm really interested in and have been throughout my career is solutions. So how do we pivot? How do we build an ecologically literate society? So one that is run according to sort of the non-negotiable ground rules of life on Earth. We are biological beings, which means we are inevitably ecological beings, embedded in ecosystems that are actually the basis of everything that we do, and certainly the basis of all law. And yet, that basic ecological reality hasn't been reflected in our legal systems. So instead of having the ecological imperatives of human life embedded into all fields of law, we've created this separate field of law that we call environmental law that in most legal systems is quite marginalized compared to something like property or corporate law. And then this separate and discrete area of law is supposed to fix the very serious environmental problems that stem from economic and political systems that are just fundamentally unsustainable. And so it's no great surprise that environmental law, working on its own in that kind of silo, has been unable to solve the big problems of global ecological sustainability. I will say that environmental law has made many important strides. And I strongly recommend to you David Boyd's book, The Optimistic Environmentalist, where he chronicles many of the victories of environmental law. There's no question environmental law has saved millions of lives, both human and non-human. and has brought some species back from the brink of extinction, has improved air quality. There's many important accomplishments of environmental law that we need to celebrate and remember and study. But certainly environmental law on its own has been unable to secure the sustainability and safety of our human communities going into the future. And because of those failures, many of us, starting about 20 years ago, in some cases earlier, began to look at rights-based approaches to environmental protection. And as Heather pointed out, we're in a very historic moment right now because the United Nations Human Rights Council has just issued a resolution recognizing the human right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So we have a breakthrough there. And as I became interested in rights-based approaches, it was just a natural evolution to begin looking at the role of constitutions. And there seemed to me to be kind of a natural fit between constitutions and ecological sustainability, because both are foundational. The Constitution is the basic legal foundation of a society. And ecology is the foundation of everything that we do, of who we are, of our being. And so it seemed to me that it made sense to embody the non-derogable laws of nature in the non-derogable laws of nations, which are constitutions. So I wanted to ask the question, what would an ecological constitution look like? If a scientifically literate state actually wanted to preserve its existence over time, taking into account the ecological context in which we're all embedded, what would it do? How would we rewrite constitutions in order to preserve the ecological basis of our societies? And I concluded that one answer is to constitutionalize ecological law. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, ecological law is a movement that has recently emerged as an alternative to traditional environmental law. And as the Oslo Manifesto spells out, ecological law, quote, internalizes the natural living conditions of human existence and makes them the basis of all law, including constitutions, human rights, property rights, corporate rights, and state sovereignty. So how do we do that? I set out to present in this short book some building blocks of an ecological constitution. And in the book, I not only lay out kind of theoretical ideas, but examples of where these are actually being implemented in countries all around the world. Because I wanted to show over and over again that it's possible. We're already seeing the beginnings of this. And what we really need is generalization, widespread adoption and implementation. So what I would like to do is just summarize the argument in the book. What are these building blocks of an ecological constitution? And since we do have a Canadian audience today, I'll also try to speak specifically about how these ideas are being implemented or could be implemented in the context of the Canadian Constitution. So here are the 6 building blocks of an ecological constitution that I've proposed. I'm sure there are many others. And as the scholarship of ecological constitutionalism evolves, we'll see other authors proposing additional components of an ecological constitution. But these are the 6 that I've highlighted in the book. 1, the principle of sustainability. 2, environmental human rights. 3, intergenerational equity and the public trust doctrine. 4, the rights of nature. 5, the precautionary principle. And 6, climate constitutionalism. So let's begin with the principle of sustainability. As many of you on the call know, this has been really authoritatively elucidated by Klaus Bosselmann in his book, The Principle of Sustainability, and his voluminous writings. And sustainability implies the ability, the capacity of societies and ecosystems to survive and thrive over the long term. So there's lots and lots of debate about the precise meaning of that term. I'm not super interested in the deep theory of those debates, but I think we can most usefully understand it the way any ordinary lay person would, that when we're talking about sustaining something, we're talking about preserving its vitality indefinitely. And Boswell makes the argument that sustainability has everything that it takes to be a binding legal principle. So yes, it's broad, but it's also extremely meaningful, much like principles such as equality, justice, even ideas like democracy. These ideas are broad, but they are meaningful. Former Chief Justice McLaughlin, in fact, said that the charter delineates a series of meaningful generalities. And through the use of scientific evidence, we can actually assess whether a particular policy leads to sustainability or undermines sustainability. A classic example in the Canadian context would be ongoing or increased financial investment by government in fossil fuel infrastructure. There's really, you couldn't find a credible ecologist or environmental economist who would say, yeah, that's a good idea. That's going to support the long-term ecological vitality of Canadian ecosystems. It's very clear, in fact, that by making large-scale public investments in fossil fuel infrastructure, you produce a phenomenon of lock-in, which makes it much more difficult to make the energy transitions that we know through an overwhelming scientific consensus are necessary in order to stabilize the climate. So in my view, codifying a principle of sustainability in constitutions does lead to meaningful results. Or could lead to meaningful results, I should say. And in Canada, I think we have a fairly clear doctrinal pathway to get there, which is through the recognition of an unwritten constitutional principle of ecological sustainability. So as we know, the Supreme Court of Canada has recognized unwritten constitutional principles, or UCPs, as implicit but binding components of the Constitution. And in fact, the Supreme Court has said that these are foundational principles in the Constitution that give rise to binding obligations on both courts and governments, and also can be used to elucidate the more specific enumerated rights set out in the Charter, for example. We saw in Quebec's secession reference that the court is actually willing to articulate binding obligations that flow from UCPs. And a UCP is particularly useful when litigants are bringing to the court novel interpretations of charter rights. So as everybody knows, there are several ongoing climate suits proceeding in Canadian courts alleging violations of charter rights. And it seems to me that to have a UCP of ecological sustainability recognized by courts would really illuminate that analysis. The climate-based charter claims are a little bit trickier than your classic environmental human rights claim, which usually involves pollution harming human health immediately. Of course, we do know that there are current ongoing harms from climate change, but really the climate debate quite clearly implicates longer term, medium to long-term sustainability. So I think it could be quite useful to courts who are trying to understand Section 7, life, liberty, and security of the person, Section 15, equality, in the context of the climate crisis, to have access to a more general foundational constitutional lodestar in the UCP of ecological sustainability. Now, I make the argument, and others have before me, including the Philippine Supreme Court in its celebrated minor Saposa decision. We've seen in some of the dissenting and lower court judgments in the Juliana case in the United States, courts recognizing that in fact, sustainability is arguably the primary imperative of constitutions. That among all the other things that constitutions are trying to do, what they're clearly trying to do is create a nation state that will persist over time on a specific territory. And in fact, it's simply impossible to do that without ensuring ecological sustainability. And the fact that it's not currently there explicitly isn't because it's fundamental, it's just because the scale of threats to sustainability just wasn't known even in the 1980s. So, it's implicit, it's of an overriding importance. It gives meaning to every other provision of the Constitution. And these are all the criteria that the Supreme Court has outlined for recognition as an unwritten constitutional principle. So I think Canada is well positioned to codify sustainability in the Constitution. We've seen a number of different UCPs argued by interveners in the climate suits, including public trust doctrine, intergenerational equity, among others, rights of children. And really any of those would be helpful, and I would support any of them. Just after several years of really wrestling with this, I think the formulation of ecological sustainability is probably optimal in terms of its scientific meaning, which I think also can translate well into legal systems. So number one, the principle of sustainability. The second building block that I argue for is the incorporation of environmental human rights. And this is reflected in the UN Human Rights Council's recent resolution recognizing that all human beings have a right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. David Boyd's research on environmental human rights, and specifically constitutional environmental rights, has, in my view, demonstrated conclusively that these constitutional rights do make a difference. So in his book, The Environmental Rights Revolution, David canvasses all of the constitutions around the world that include these rights and compares those nations to similar nations, so those in similar regions, those at similar levels of development, et cetera, and concludes that the presence of an environmental right, an enforceable environmental right in a constitution, leads to better environmental legislation, better outcomes in environmental litigation, and most importantly, improvements in ecological footprint. So, in other words, nations that include an environmental human right do better ecologically than those that don't. These rights are framed in different language around the world. They're mostly quite explicitly anthropocentric. So they're mostly quite explicitly focused on what humans need. And as I mentioned previously, most of the case law, not all, but most of the case law involves humans that are targeting pollution hotspots. So these are people that are living in some of the most polluted ecosystems in the world. And we've seen courts issue really progressive decisions in these cases with real results on the ground. So David, for example, uses two basins, two kind of aquatic ecosystems, one in Argentina and Riachuelo, and then Manila Bay in the Philippines, which were really horrendously polluted with very serious consequences to the human inhabitants. In both cases, courts found violations of the constitutional environmental human right. In both cases, courts retained jurisdiction of the case while their orders were being implemented. And we saw massive cleanups, major improvements, both for human and non-human inhabitants of those areas. And we've also seen environmental human rights, in fact, explicitly furthering a sustainability agenda. I'm thinking, for example, of the Urgenda climate case out of the Netherlands, where one of the court's basis for its decision ordering the Netherlands government to significantly improve its climate agenda was the fact that the Constitution protected the right to a healthy environment. So I think there's certainly an open question about whether an environmental human right properly belongs kind of in the world of ecological law. Carlos Spare, who I think has given us probably the most authoritative and compelling articulation of ecological law, argues that to qualify as ecological law, the provision or the framework must be ecocentric. And it's pretty clear that these environmental human rights are not ecocentric. I include them in the book because whether or not they form part of sort of the canon of ecological law, I think it's quite clear that they support the project of ecological sustainability. So whether they not they have sort of the imprimatur of ecological law, they're just too useful to ignore. They're so important. And particularly in the West, in some of the developed countries that have been the largest contributors to global ecological crisis, rights have such a powerful discursive function too, that it's not just that it's something you can bring to court. It shapes the way people feel about life and their entitlements and what's reasonable to expect from government, So as when people begin to feel like they have a right to reasonable internet prices, suddenly this becomes a political priority, and you can't get elected unless you make sure that people get reasonable internet prices, because they come to believe I have a right to this, And imagine how it would be if people felt like, I have a right to clean air. Like, this rampant rate of asthma that's going on in my community, like, that's not right. I should be able to expect more of my government, especially with something like air pollution that we know is such a solvable problem. But that's another topic. If people start to think, maybe I have a right to climate stability, like maybe it's reasonable for me to expect the governments of the world will manage our shared resources in such a way that I can have the peace of mind that my children are going to be okay and their children are going to be okay, that we are going to preserve and repair the biosphere in such a way that I can have faith in the continuity of my family and my community, So I think that rights are too good to pass up. I certainly understand that, in the human rights world, and there's colleagues on the call, they're, much more well-informed and much more expert in human rights theory than I am. And I know that even in the human world, there's people that question the rights paradigm. But as somebody that's coming out of kind of the litigation world and really looking for solutions, I think rights are too good to pass up. So secondly, environmental human rights. Thirdly, intergenerational equity and the public trust doctrine. So intergenerational equity is exactly what it sounds like. It's the recognition of obligations on the present generation to both ensure equal access to planetary resources for those who are currently alive. That's the intragenerational equity component of intergenerational equity. And to ensure that these resources are available for future generations. So, the lack of an intergenerational perspective in legal systems is a major cause of the ecological crisis. And this brings me to an important point, which kind of overlaps with my previous point around environmental human rights, which is that one of the most important things that an ecological constitution can do is to empower indigenous nations and indigenous communities to not only, receive environmental entitlements, like, the right to the sustainability of their traditional lands and waters, but to exercise environmental self-governance and self-governance writ large. Now, there's a lot of brilliant writers writing in this area, and I really don't have time to do it justice, but I'll just say, as John Burroughs has said, this is not to essentialize Indigenous communities by any means, or to suggest that all Indigenous practice or principle throughout time, has been ecological. But it's very clear that many Indigenous nations have done a much better job over time than many, contemporary nation states in terms of stewarding and managing natural systems in a sustainable way. And as Burroughs says, the subjugation of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous thought systems, Indigenous legal systems was a great loss for all humanity because there is so much to be learned. And the wonderful thing is, in an era of Indigenous legal resurgence, as well as reconciliation, we are now seeing Indigenous legal concepts coming into constitutions and fundamental legal orders with really great results. So for example, in New Zealand, under the Treaty of Waitangi, which is understood as part of the Constitution of New Zealand, there has been a longstanding process, very much like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission process. And one of the outcomes of that has been the recognition of the legal personhood of a river, a volcano, and a mountain ecosystem that was formerly a national park. In that mountain ecosystem, Te Urewera, the management board is controlled by Maori according to Maori law. And this has resulted in really significant differences on the ground. So immediately, one of the things that that agency did was change the regulatory goal from managing these lands for the benefit of the public, which was the previous paradigm under the Parks Act, to managing the behavior of people for the benefit of the land. And they do this in a number of ways. For example, a very respected Indigenous elder has trained teams of young people, bush teams, who live in the forest, monitor its needs, report back to the management agency. So we see a change in the way information is gathered. There's been a really significant change in the management of an invasive species, particularly specifically possums, if I'm getting that right, which were previously managed using toxic chemicals. And what they've done now is essentially crowdsourced it, and those populations are being controlled through subsistence hunting. So to many Maori and possibly non-Maori individuals engaging in subsistence hunting, those populations are now being kept under control without poisoning ecosystems. So I think there's a huge potential in terms of sustainability in empowering Indigenous environmental self-governance and recognizing Indigenous law. And I bring this up in the context of this chapter on intergenerational equity, because of course, we know multiple Indigenous legal systems that have recognized that. Many of us will be familiar with the Haudenosaunee concept of the 7 generations, that when we take action, or we could think, in this case, when you pass a statute, when you're deciding whether to invest in an oil pipeline, you're obligated to consider its impact on the 7th generation. In Western legal systems, we haven't seen binding obligations of intergenerational equity for the most part. There's a provision in the German Constitution that's quite progressive on that. We've seen moves to appoint ombudsmen for future generations, et cetera. But this is something that we really need to see in constitutions. And again, we know for sure that can have an impact because we have seen it in litigation in a number of places around the world. For example, in the Miners Oposa case in the Philippines, where the Supreme Court canceled, I think at the time it was either the vast majority or all outstanding forestry licenses because they violated the rights of future generations. So we know that an obligation of intergenerational equity can make a difference. The public trust doctrine is really just kind of a domestic instantiation of intergenerational equity. So this doctrine holds that the state is trustee of public resources for present and future generations. And when the state takes action that violates the rights of future generations, that degrades that resources for the present and future, that in fact that action is null and void. And the public trust doctrine has had tons of litigation success, mostly in the United States, but also in India and in Kenya. So once again, it's something we know that it works because we've seen results. Rights of nature. Rights of nature, in my view, is probably the most radical, but also the most exciting branch or stream of ecological law. And this recognizes that nature has legal personality and legal rights. And as I mentioned, this has happened in New Zealand through legislation, but originating in a kind of quasi-constitutional process. And obviously most famously in Ecuador. So the Ecuadorian constitution recognizes an indigenous concept of Pachamama, or Mother Earth, and recognizes the rights of Mother Earth in some detail. So the rights, for example, the preservation, regeneration, restoration, etc. that provision has not ensured a kind of overall sustainable policy in Ecuador, but it has been very effective in a certain number of cases. And Martin and Kaufman have done a really great analysis of rights of nature in Ecuador, where it's codified in the Constitution, in New Zealand, where we see it in statute, and it's very much a part of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and in India, where it's largely been judge-made law. So judges have recognized rights of ecosystems in India, in Bangladesh, and elsewhere. We are seeing a move in Canada to at least begin forwarding the rights of nature agenda, led by Indigenous nations in a couple of different places. We haven't, really had time to see how those initiatives will play out and how they might make a difference on the ground. But rights of nature, I think, is a fairly pivotal concept. Where possible politically, I think it should be codified in constitutions. And again, I think it has a really important discursive role as well. So just to get people thinking about the idea that, maybe nature is not just sort of like a free big box store where I can go and take what I want, but in fact, maybe nature has a beingness and needs that require respect and attention. I think that idea of relating to nature on some level of equality is really salutary. And again, as we make this journey to sustainability, it's of course as much philosophical or mental or mind state change that we need in order to make the material changes that are necessary. And I think even to begin to think about nature as having rights is a really useful and potentially transformative step. So rights of nature. 5, the precautionary principle. And this really just helps us to understand how we resolve the inevitable problems of scientific uncertainty when any of the other provisions in an ecological constitution are implemented. So if we, let's say, take the federal government to court based on a UCP of ecological sustainability, arguing that clearly investment in the pipeline undermines sustainability, and the government comes back with, well, that's not absolutely certain. It's very complicated. We can look at emissions modelings. There's conflicting models. And the precautionary principle says, well, if there's a credible risk of serious and irreversible harm, then we take the cautious approach. It seems pretty likely that investing in the pipeline is going to be a problem for sustainability, and that's enough. We're not demanding scientific certainty. Similarly, with claims based on environmental and human rights, even in pollution claims, there's always uncertainty to some level, except in the most extreme, sort of disaster scenarios. But even somewhere that's a known pollution hotspot, I'm thinking of the Aamjiwnaang community near Sarnia, Ontario, for example, there's still going to be some level of scientific uncertainty about the causation of the illnesses that are clustered there. And the precautionary principle says, well, we go with the better safe than sorry approach, that scientific uncertainty is not an excuse to refrain from taking positive protective action. So the precautionary principle, I think, is quite important as an interpretive aid to understand and implement every other aspect of the ecological constitution. And then finally, climate provisions. So this is obviously an incredibly hot area now, because all around the world, litigants are seeking to find implicit climate guarantees in their constitution. And some constitutions have explicitly recognized an obligation to regulate for a safe or stable climate. There's no binding right to a safe climate in any constitution around the world, like explicitly codified. So, I think that's an area to look at. I think that could be very useful going forward for nations that are currently redrafting their constitutions. For example, Chile, where environmental rights, ecological obligations are very much on the table as the constitution is reimagined and redrafted. And, rather than kind of pushing judges to find climate guarantees in other provisions, I think it makes sense to have a clearly articulated and binding climate right, among others. So that's my quick summary of the book. Very happy to take questions or comments.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Collins. So does anyone have questions or comments, insights, observations? Yes, Sylvia, Professor Rich.
Hi, thanks so much for that. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, it's it's good. It's inspiring. My question is about personhood. So you said we need a philosophical change, which makes a lot of sense. Sorry, I'm gonna get there in 1 second. I look at personhood on the kind of the side of non-human entities, but that are corporations rather than the natural entities. And people talk a lot about responsibilities and what rights are correlated to responsibilities. And I think some people, and I think this is the right line to take, is to say you can have responsibilities without rights. The fact that we recognize personhood in order to put responsibilities onto corporations doesn't mean that we also need to recognize corporate rights, which I think, yeah, there's some danger there, right? Corporate rights to vote, etc. But so this seems like it would be maybe the other side, where you might have rights without responsibilities. And what does that mean? And like, I think personhood is a legal category, but I think it's more than that too. I think it is a social category. And I think that, you know, animals as persons makes a lot of sense in that kind of social understanding. And it's more of a stretch for me to think of trees and rivers as persons, but not that much of a stretch. But I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what that philosophical change would look like, and also maybe pragmatically what the effects would be of recognizing personhood. What does that mean in terms of who shows up to guarantee those rights or to defend them? Or
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, excellent insights. I love all of that. And of course, what's interesting about corporations is they have a ton of rights, even if it's not framed that way, but just their property rights, you know. And that's kind of one of the things that theorists have pointed out, is just if you have corporations that enjoy legal rights, which, you know, they have a ton of legal rights at present, and nature has no legal personhood, it's just not a fair fight. It's pretty, you can predict how that's going to go. You know, that's not really complicated. But I think you're absolutely right that recognizing the personhood of nature does mean recognizing rights without responsibility. And that has been raised as a concern by critics of rights of nature. For example, one of the first cases to recognize the rights of an ecosystem was a decision out of India recognizing the personhood of the Yamuna and Ganga rivers. And the court appointed certain government officers as guardians in loco parentis, as the court put it, of the rivers. And those guardians appealed the judgment and won. So they got out of it. And one of the things they said is, you know, if you recognize the legal personality of these rivers and we're the human spokespeople, are we going to be sued when the river, you know, floods downstream, people lose their homes or whatever? And I mean, my own view of that is it's actually not really that complicated. The Indian judgment, unfortunately, actually said we recognize the person of the river, including having all the rights, responsibilities, and obligations of a natural person or whatever. And, you know, it seems to me pretty clear that we can't recognize legal obligations on an ecosystem. But the thing is, that's just absolutely not new in our legal systems. We don't have any problem with that. Obviously, the rights of young children, the rights of people in coma, you know, we don't have any trouble recognizing rights without obligation. And in fact, typically when we do that, it's an entity that's highly vulnerable. So, you know, it's really, really important to recognize the rights of those entities that don't really have the agency to act in the way that a corporation or, you know, a highly privileged adult human does. So yeah, so I don't see that as a problem, but I think that is absolutely what's happening, and we should just acknowledge that. And in terms of who represents them, yeah, so Kaufman and Martin, I think, have done the best job of really showing what works best. And what they have found in comparing rights of nature regimes is that the most effective approach is where the rights of nature provision is accompanied by a multi-stakeholder management agency And in particular, that's largely controlled by local communities, and in those cases, largely indigenous communities. And that too, I think, is especially relevant in Canada. In Colombia, where courts have also recognized rights of nature through judicial decisions, the court created a new category of right, a concept of rights that they call biocultural rights, that recognize simultaneously the rights of the ecosystems with the rights of local peoples, both to benefit from the ecosystems and to manage the ecosystems according to their own traditions and customs, as the court puts it in that particular case. So it's a trusteeship model. You do need a spokesperson for the natural entity. Of course, that can get complicated, but it's not insoluble. It's not insurmountable. It can be done.
No, that's awesome. Thank you so much. I really like that idea of analogizing to persons without capacity. I think that's really helpful.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Thomas.
In New Zealand, I think it's a joint.
It's a joint, but the way, so whether the regimes are slightly different with the river, the Waitangi River versus Te Urewera, but the way it worked was it was like equal appointees for the Crown and the Maori. Now the Crown appointed a well-known Maori activist as its representative, but then there was like a sunset provision. So after so many years, it was controlled by like the Maori communities had more seats at the table. And what's ended up happening is the management agencies are guided by Maori people according to Maori law.
Okay, I think Professor Borelli had a question. Thomas?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Lynda, for the summary. I didn't read the book yet, but I will definitely do it because it's exactly the kind of research I like, like defining a framework, and then it just opened like so many perspective of analysis, like, okay, how many constitutions in the world have like the principle you are defining, and what are the best constitutions so far? I can see like a lot of stuff, and I would like to know actually if you started doing this job, like trying to rate the constitution, like which constitution is the best according to your principles. And so one question is, how many constitutions did you read for this work? Because it feels like monumental. And also, okay, so are you able to do a comparison, and are you doing it? And finally, I would like to know, how did you choose the principle you use, and how did you stop, adding new principles that could be in the constitution? And because I see there is a logic, of course, and at some point you need to stop. So how did you do this, like in terms of method?
Okay, those are all excellent questions. So no, I didn't try to rate constitutions relative to each other, except to say that the Ecuadorian constitution is probably by any measure the most ecological constitution in the world. And it's not just because of the rights of nature provision. It also has a strong environmental human rights provision, and a strong precautionary provision. It recognizes the principle of sustainability, or I should say a principle that's related to that, the indigenous Andean concept of summa camana, or the good way of life, good living. And it also fleshes out a lot of these principles. So it looks specifically at environmental health, the obligation of environmental education, etc. So other than to recognize sort of a clear winner, but again, there's implementation problems in Ecuador, so it's not perfect. But other than that, I didn't try to sort of rank constitutions, and I think that's a very interesting idea. That would be very interesting for future research. In terms of how many constitutions incorporate principles, sustainability, climate rights, etc., I did do that. I don't remember any of those numbers off the top of my head, but if you look at the book, it'll say, this many constitutions explicitly recognize a principle of sustainability. Then I also looked at constitutions that didn't use the word, but clearly codified the idea. So constitutions that said, for example, the state shall manage natural resources for the benefit of present and future generations. I consider that, of humans and non-humans, let's say, I consider that codification of the principle of sustainability. And I also looked at provisions that use the word sustainability, but are actually not ensuring ecological sustainability. So sometimes they're using the language of sustainable development, and then the provision and the next, I think it might've been Albania, and the next sentence says, with a priority for growth, or, they'll use the concept of wise use or wise management, which we know typically means natural resource exploitation. Yeah, so I did I did try to look at numbers. I didn't sit down and read every constitution of the world. I searched constitutions through an excellent platform. I'll just write it in the chat, called Constitute Project, which has translated all of the constitutions of the world into English, and it's a searchable database. So you can search sustainability, and then you kind of have to get creative and think, well, what would be other terms that would be in there, like future generations that might be capturing sustainability without using the word. Yeah, there was a lot of reading, but it was actually quite fascinating. I think I'm missing the, how did I know when to stop? Partly I was fortunate in that I have a preference for shorter pieces, and this book is published through Routledge's Focus series. So I had a page limit of somewhere around like 100, 110 manuscript pages. So it had to be short. And so I had to really think about what were the essentials. And you know how it is, it's just the years of research and reading and thinking that you start to develop opinions about what is the absolute basic. For sure, one could argue that you should include the polluter pays principle. Sort of a complicated reasoning why I didn't include it in the essential building blocks. I think polluter pays principle tends to sort of indirectly support all of these other principles. It's a great instrumentalist approach. For me, it didn't have the kind of fundamental character that you look for in a constitutional principle, but I totally understand those who would disagree. And like I said, I imagine that as this scholarship advances, people will, propose others. There was also a big question in my mind about how to address Indigenous rights, Indigenous environmental entitlements, and self-governance. And I had initially thought that I would do a chapter on that, but what I realized was that I actually wanted it to be integrated, that I wanted it to be a part of every other chapter, of every concept that we talk about, to look at how that applies in the Indigenous context, how Indigenous rights, Indigenous self-determination interact with that principle, forward that principle, etc.
Thank you. Dr. Lilo? Oh, sorry, were you finished, Professor Berlin?
No, I was just saying thank you, because it's incredible and it's huge. And I like this kind of systematic work. You look at every constitution, and it's just so exciting, and it's good to see it finished and done. It's amazing.
Yes, thank you. I like seeing it finished too.
Dr. Lilo?
Thank you. Well, Professor Collins, as usual, it's a very fascinating, inspiring work. But thank you for sharing this today, and also thank you to the Center for organizing the event. It's always great to be here. So I have two questions for you. The first one, and I'm sorry, it's also relating to legal personhood and rights of nature. But do you see a difference when it comes to granting rights or legal personality to an ecosystem versus to granting rights or legal personhood to nature as a whole? What are the different implications? And I'm thinking in terms of applicability. I think probably quite two different strategies, two different approach. And the other one is, do you have any thoughts on the recent Magpie River case in Quebec, where I think it was the first case in Canada where a river and a watershed actually was granted legal personality? And do you see this as a upcoming trend in the Canadian context?
Yeah, great questions. And of course, I really benefited from your own scholarship on rights of nature and rights of water in particular. Maybe you can put the title of your paper in the chat.
Thank you, Lynda.
But yeah, so I do think there's a very significant difference in recognizing rights of the earth as a whole, or rights of nature in a general way, versus rights of ecosystems. I think recognizing rights of nature as a whole can be really useful in terms of consciousness raising, and it can work on the ground. That is the formulation in Ecuador, and it has succeeded in a number of important cases in Ecuador, where the courts have been able to kind of bridge the gap between the general, the idea of Mother Earth, to a specific river. For example, I'm thinking of one of the early cases, Wheeler. So it's possible, but I think it's probably easier to apply and implement when we're looking at a specific ecosystem. And I think that conclusion flows as a fair extrapolation from the research of Kaufman and Martin, where they're talking about, legal rights of nature as the basis for a new method of management, and creating permanent indigenous-led, often, management systems. So, obviously it's easier to manage a particular ecosystem than to set up an agency to manage the earth, So, I think in most cases, it's also probably going to be politically far more achievable because, the wonderful thing is, I think often where rights of nature succeed, it's flowing from a community of local people who are connected to that land, either through their indigenous, systems of cosmology, of law, of culture, or just through living there and, what E.O. Wilson calls biophilia, that natural impulse to love nature and the world around us. And I think it's often those, certainly in the United States, where we've seen the biggest expansion of rights of nature ordinances. Now, those are local ordinances that are easily struck down by the states. Those haven't had a big pragmatic impact, but in terms of the spread of this idea, it's gone like wildfire in the States. And that's what it comes from. It comes from local people who love their wetland, their forest, their land, their mountains, or whatever. So that was the first question. Then the second question, what was the second question?
It was about the Magpie River.
Oh,
in
Magpie
Quebec.
River, right. So
Yeah.
totally exciting. I have to say, I was expecting Canada to lag way behind just because we have been a little bit behind on ecological constitutionalism. And when we started to seeing that, and also the work by M.A. Kraft and colleagues in the prairies, it was incredibly inspiring. The Magpie River is also a local ordinance. And as I understand, it was a partnership between the municipality and the First Nation, which in itself is incredibly inspiring and reassuring, and I think really maps out a way forward. And I certainly hope that it's the beginning of a movement here. I think we have all the ingredients for that. We certainly have obviously vibrant Indigenous communities engaged in processes of resurgence. And we have, many Indigenous and non-Indigenous people that just love the nature around them. So I think we have what we need, certainly, at least for those local ordinances. In terms of, binding rights of nature provisions that are going to actually be able to prevent destructive development, I think we have a ways to go in the Canadian legal system, but you never know. Sometimes you see rights expansions that are kind of shocking in their speed. And Boyd writes about that in his book, Rights of Nature, that, this may seem radical, but in fact, the expansion of rights has always been treated as radical and always seemed impossible until it happened. Anything from, women's right to vote to something that I have more personal experience with because I witnessed it in my own lifetime, say same-sex spousal rights in Canada, which really, when I was a teenager seemed unthinkable. It wasn't even something that people in polite society would talk about, let alone changing, centuries of law around what marriage is and who's entitled to spousal benefits, and that changed really in historic terms very rapidly, in the space of 10 years, really, a really world-changing transformation. So I never want to give up on even radical legal transformation. I think, in rights of nature, what we're seeing now is other places are taking the lead. And that's partly why I wanted to write this book, because I've written a lot about Canadian constitutional approaches to environmental protection. And, the reality is in certain areas, the most exciting action is just not happening here. So I wanted to see, because, we're not the only game in town, and we can learn. We can be inspired and informed, and we can learn from what's happening in India and Bangladesh and in Ecuador and Bolivia. And, many of the standout, most exciting things are happening outside the country. But you do also see some glimmers here. For example, in the Tsilhqot'in case on Aboriginal title, the Supreme Court did hold that the Crown couldn't violate Aboriginal title in a way that would prevent future generations from enjoying the lands. So they recognize intergenerational equity, at least in that specific context. So we have potential, but there's a lot of work to be done in Canada in terms of improving the ecological literacy of the judiciary. And what's cool is it is happening. I'm starting to hear from colleagues that they're being invited to NJI events to train judges. I think the climate litigation has had a profound impact in terms of improving judges' ecological literacy. It's made a huge, huge difference. It's like they're a captive audience. You got to listen. It's like a mandatory workshop on climate science. And as there's more of those being filed, I think I've said, like, even if they lose, they have a huge value in terms of judicial education. So yes, I certainly hope that Magpie is the beginning of something more here.
Thank you so much. And I recently read that the stakeholders involved in this case were actually putting pressure on the Quebec government to recognize what they did and the legal personhood and the rights of the river, which ought to be an interesting one if they succeed.
Yeah. Something exciting to watch for sure. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Collins.
Fantastic. Thomas?
I have another question, but if someone else wants to go, let's go. No, but my question would be about the court, Lynda, because you the constitution, okay, good. And let's say that one day we have a perfect constitution, like with very strong principles. What about the courts, and especially the Supreme Court? And well, of course, yeah, no. What are your thoughts about the courts and the judges and their, like, should we have a special court or not?
I'm agnostic on that. I think there's others that have more expertise than I do in terms of whether we need a special court, but I would like to see at least a basic level of ecological literacy on all courts, because I do think that ecological law needs to permeate every area of law. So it might be a corporate law dispute, but it might be very important that the judge has at least a basic understanding of what's at stake ecologically. I'm thinking about, for example, securities climate disclosure. We really need judges to, in my opinion, get off the bench and get into the game in terms of sustainability. I have a chapter called Judging the Anthropocene, where I talk about the space for judicial role in ensuring ecological sustainability. And I think there's a ton of space for that. And as I say, like, we can look elsewhere for inspirations. The rights of nature decisions out of India are just a joy to read. They're profound, they're stirring, they're compelling. You get tears in your eyes, they really get it. And similarly, the judgments out of Colombia, it's clearly possible for judges to play a really positive, productive role in ecological sustainability. In Canada, I think if you did a broad-based study on judicial treatment of environmental matters, one thing comes through loud and clear, which is, on the whole, judges have been confident that the government is dealing with this and it's the government's job. And that comes through whether it's framed doctrinally as toxic tort, whether it's an administrative law problem, whether it's framed in constitutional terms. We have seen in the past that courts don't want to touch it, don't want to deal with the science, and feel confident that the government is handling it. I see for the first time in my career that changing with the climate litigation. I think, for me, the most exciting thing about the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Act reference wasn't just that carbon pricing was upheld, which was crucial, but the court clearly recognized that climate change is happening, and it's been happening on the government's watch. In other words, you shouldn't just sleep peacefully trusting that the government is handling it. I hope that is sort of a loss of innocence that is permanent, because it's been a really strange kind of anomaly, because courts don't just trust the government to, respect human rights properly. If the police say to them, don't worry, we are treating people well, the court doesn't just say, yeah, okay. But that's essentially what we've seen in environmental litigation. As I say, and no matter what the context, statute, doesn't matter what statute is, doesn't matter what the ground is, if it's min-law, if it's toxicity, they've just been like, well, the government's handling it. And I think that the climate litigation has hopefully destroyed that idea once and for all, because that's a pretty hard thing to overcome. That's where we get over-deference in administrative law. That's where we get these conservative, narrow interpretations of tort doctrine and toxic tort cases, justiciability rulings, and constitutional cases. So I think if you change that one pillar and convince the court, actually, you're an MVP, like you've got a very important role to play in this, you're light years ahead of where you were. And I think that's happening.
Yeah, you're completely right with the climate litigation, because it's everywhere. I know in France, we had some cases as well, and it was very surprising to see judges saying like, no, now you have to do something. I give you like 2 years talking to the government to be like more ambitious. So it's crazy, because we didn't expect it. So it's really cool. And it's a last comment, maybe, Lynda, but
yes,
I'm really like excited to see your work on the climate provisions in Constitution. So first I will read the chapter, and then I will be very curious to see like what could it look like in a Constitution, because it's I think it's one of the next step, like
yes,
and we have to do it very soon, like in the next
yes, yeah. It'll be really interesting to see what Chile does. I think that's probably our best chance right now in terms of a short term, where there might be a real victory soon there. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who came, and hello to anybody that might be listening on a recording. I'm always happy to hear from anybody who's researching this area or has questions. And of course, in such a short book, I couldn't say everything, but I think I've cited to some really exciting scholars in the book for those who want to learn more.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful start to our speaker series this year. And yes, the book is a pleasure to read. So I'm jealous of all of you who haven't done it yet, because it's a huge pleasure. Thank you.
Do we have a question from Charlotte? I saw a hand raised.
Oh.
Or was it approval or?
Yes, hello. I wasn't sure if you guys were wrapping up, so I put my hand down. But thank you for having me, Professor. I'm so sorry I had a class break before this, so I didn't hear your presentation, but I'm very looking forward to reading your book. I do have a question about, the anthropocentrism that is really exhibited in our judicial system and toxic torts, et cetera, and how we can apply that in the Canadian context to actually define the benefits that we get from ecologies and ecosystems, and how the concepts of ecological health and One Health can participate in helping us form a more principled and strong ecological constitution. I'm not sure if you covered this in your presentation, and I'm sorry if I'm being redundant.
No, you're not being redundant at all. And I think those are excellent comments, and I'm loving this emerging idea of planetary health. It's so cool that the University of Ottawa's medical school is the first one in the country to appoint a director of planetary health. And I think you're absolutely right that essentially anthropocentrism isn't really a problem if it's ecologically literate. So if you recognize that in fact you can't have any of the things that you want as a human community without the thriving of your non-human fellow earthmates, I think. And actually, it's really interesting. If you read some of the most cutting edge judgments, such as the ones coming out of Colombia on rights of nature, you see a real blurring of anthropocentrism and ecocentrism. Like you in the most recent and innovative jurisprudence on ecological law, I actually begin to feel that the binary doesn't even really make sense anymore. If you recognize humans as an animal species, like other animal species sharing the earth, then actually, in many cases, certainly in terms of general dialogues of global sustainability, I don't see anthropocentrism actually as a massive challenge. And I think planetary boundaries are a good example of that. Planetary boundaries are set based on providing a safe operating space for humanity. But if you look at what they are, they would do immense good to all non-human, occupants of the earth. So, there's certainly, of course, there are times where there's an opposition between human interest, immediate human interest, and the interest of the non-human world. But if you're looking at, human interest in terms of long-term and global human interest, the interests of everybody, not the privileged few, then you come to see that, in fact, we can't forward human interest without ecological health. That there's no human health without ecological health. And just quickly in 3 minutes, I actually think looking at human health can be one of the most powerful ways to sell environmental improvements. So if you want to get on the news and say, we should improve air quality in Ottawa for the birds, there'll be a small community of birders who will be right on side. But if you point out that by improving air quality, we could give the gift of health, we could save thousands of lives a year in the province of Ontario. That's what the Ontario Medical Association is telling us. It's not my little idea. That's what the most qualified scientists are telling. You could save thousands of lives. You could save children from, hundreds of days of missed schools, hundreds of times they would be in emerged, but they don't have to be because we've cleaned up the air. It's actually like jaw-droppingly exciting opportunity to give people health without their actually having to participate, without their having to change their diet or exercise in a particular, ecological improvements are one of the most powerful ways we can improve health on a population basis. And yes, I agree with you, Charlotte, that I think publicizing that could be a really important communications tool to get people on side for ecologizing constitutions and laws in general.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I was just wondering a little bit about whether those health models of ecological rights had been used in the development of constitutions yet, as either to just promote them or to actually reason for why they are necessary, or whether they're entirely framed at the moment in just the realm of natural personhood and inherent rights of natural entities.
Mm-hmm. There are some constitutions that make the link, and particularly Ecuador, between health and ecological sustainability. But I didn't look at that specifically, so I wouldn't want to give a definitive answer.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. That was very inspiring and, as usual, sort of hope-producing, happiness-producing session. So thank you very much for all of this.
Thank you.